In Lesson 6, we're going to learn about the validation rule and validation text properties. If you want to control the values that go into a specific field, you can use the validation rule property. The validation rule allows you to specify the range of values or specific value that can go into a particular field. For example, let's say we never want the customer's discount rate to be higher than 50%. 50% is the maximum value that can go into this field. So click on discount rate, then come down here in the properties and find validation rule. I'll type in less than, equal to, 0.5. What does that mean? That means the data that goes into this field has to be less than or equal to 0.5, which is 50%. Here are the different symbols you can use. These are called inequalities. There's greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and then there's not equal to, which is simply a greater than sign and a less than sign next to each other. So the validation rule for this field is less than or equal to 0.5. So the user can type in any value he wants as long as it's less than 0.5. Let's give it a try. I'll save my table with Control S. Now when I do, I get this warning message. It says data integrity rules have changed. Existing data may not be valid for the new rules. Essentially, Access has to apply this validation rule and make sure that all the data in the table is up to spec. So do you want the existing data to be tested with the new rules? I'll say yes. And now we have a problem. It says existing data violates the new setting for the validation rule property. All right, so we have some data in there that doesn't meet our criteria. Now you have three options. You can keep the new setting and continue the testing. You can revert back to the old setting, which is no validation rule. Or you can stop the testing and click cancel. I'm going to say no. Let's go back to our old validation rule. Let's manually go in and take a look at the data real quick and make sure everything's up to spec. So I'll switch over to Datasheet View, find the discount rate column, and right here, that first one is 50.7%. So that's not going to match our new validation rule. I'll just change that back to 50. And now we should be all set. Let's save it and go back into Design View again. Let's put our validation rule back in here, less than or equal to 0.5. Save it. All right, data integrity rules have changed. Do you want to test the existing data? Sure, yes. Okay, I'm still getting the error message. It says the data violates the new setting. Let's see if we can figure out exactly what the problem is this time. I'll hit cancel. Here's my discount rate column. Let's take a look. Oh, look at this down here. I have two blank values. Those are called null values. They have no data in them. Now, null values, or empty fields, are not less than or equal to 50%. They're not the same as a zero value, and that's what's causing the error. So you can either delete these records, or you can put in zeros in here. I'll just put zeros in. That is why, if you're going to have a validation rule, you should consider also setting a default value, so this doesn't happen. Okay, one more time, let's go back into Design View. Make sure you've got your validation rule there, 0.5. I'll hit Save again. Do you want to test the data? I'll say yes. And this time, I don't get the second warning message. So all the data in the table matches the validation rule. Now let's go mess with the data. Here I am back in Datasheet View. Let's try changing one of these values. Let's go with 65%. As soon as I try to press Enter or Tab, I get a message. It says one or more values are prohibited by the validation rule set for the customer T.discount rate. So we got yelled at that the data that we tried to put in there doesn't match the validation rule. Now, this isn't very user-friendly text. That brings up another property called validation text. Let's hit OK. I'll press Escape on my keyboard. If you press Escape while you're editing a field, it cancels the edit, and if you hit it a second time, it cancels the editing of the entire record. So if you change 2 or 3 things, you can hit escape, and it will go back to what the record was. So if I were to come over here, for example, and change this to 1,000, and then press tab, and change this to 15, if I were to hit escape once, the discount rate reverts back to 0. If I hit it a second time, watch the pencil all the way to the left go away. And the num employees went back to 3,500. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's a little trick there. If you're editing a record and you realize you goof, if you hit escape a couple times, it'll revert back to what it used to be. Now back in design view, here's my validation rule. Right below it is the validation text. Now this is just an error message that shows up if the user violates the rule. So I'll type in discount rate must be 50% or less. Okay, a simple English phrase. Save it. Let's go back to datasheet view. Find your discount rate, and let's violate the rule. Let's put in 70%. I'll press enter. And there's my warning message. Discount rate must be 50% or less. And that looks a lot better than the default warning message. So make sure you set your own nice, user-friendly validation text. I'll click OK, and then just press escape. Now, here's another problem. What happens if I type in negative 10%? That's allowed, because negative 10% is less than 50%. So that technically is okay with the validation rule. So what we need to do is specify a range of values that's okay, between 0 and 50%. There are 2 ways you can do that. First, let's get rid of this, put it back to 0, so we don't get yelled at again that the existing data violates the rule. Now let's go back to design view. Let's change this. We can say greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 0.5. With our inequalities, we can use the keywords and or. So for example, in this particular case, I can say greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 0.5. So our values can be between 0% and 50%. If you switch things around to use the or keyword, that's usually excluding something from a range of values. For example, this says less than 10 or greater than 20. So numbers like 5, 6, and 7 are okay. Numbers like 30, 40, and 50 are okay, but you couldn't use the value 15 because that's not less than 10 or greater than 20. So again, for our particular case, it's greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 0.5. Let's save our table. Again, I'll say yes to test the data. Let's go back to datasheet view, find our discount rates, and let's play with the data. Let's put in here 15. Okay, that works fine. Let's put in here 80. Nope, I get yelled at. Okay. Let's put in here negative 5%. And I get yelled at again. Maybe we should change the validation text to say the discount rate must be between 0 and 50%. I'll hit OK. I'll press escape a couple of times. All right, there, I'll change it. Discount rate must be between 0% and 50%. That brings up another keyword we can also use. If you don't want to use greater than, less than, and equal to, you can change this to between, that's an actual keyword, 0 and 0.5. Now the between keyword does include the endpoints. All right, so keep that in mind. The between keyword also allows the endpoints. So that'll allow values between 0 and 50%. Okay, that is the between keyword. And you will also find that I capitalize all of my special keywords and function names. You don't have to. Access is not case sensitive. That's just a matter of habit. It goes back to my programming days when I can clearly see the names of functions as opposed to my variable names. In fact, half the time, you'll see that Access will actually proper case that on me, like here between, it changed it to a capital B and lowercase the rest of it. Don't worry about that. Access, again, is not case sensitive. But between 0 and 0.5, and we can give it a test. Save the table, say yes, switch back to datasheet view, and give it a try. 65, and you get yelled at. Hit OK. Try -2. I get yelled at again. And let's try 7. And everything's fine. So that's the validation rule. What other fields might we set some validation rules on? How about credit limit? Let's say we never want to give a credit limit more than $5,000. So I can come down here, set a validation rule less than or equal to 5,000. Set the validation text to maximum credit limit is $5,000. Save it. Perform the data check. Now we've got data that violates the rule. Let's hit cancel. Switch over to datasheet view. Let's put some values in here real quick. I'll just put in zeros. And while you're here, I'm going to save you a step. Put a couple of date values in here too. Just put January 1st. Because the next one we do is going to be customer sense. It'll save us a trip back in here. But let's try putting some bogus values in here now. Let's try putting in 7,000. And there you go. Maximum credit limit is $5,000. And yes, we could set up a range as well, so it has to be between 0 and 5,000. I'll hit OK. This might make more sense, between 0 and 5,000. We could leave the validation text alone. Here's another one. How about the customer sense validation rule? Now, it's a customer database. Let's say we've been in business since 1980. So this value shouldn't be before 1980. But it also shouldn't be in the future either. If they try putting in tomorrow's date, well, they couldn't have been a customer since tomorrow. It should be today is the maximum date. Now, in the last lesson, we learned about the automatic date function, where it'll take today's date and substitute it in. Wouldn't that be cool if we could use it in the validation rule? Let's come down here and try it. Let's say the validation rule has to be between 1/1/1980, since that's when we've been in business for, and today's date, which is the date field. I'll press enter. Now notice what happens. Access puts little pound symbols around your date. That's just what it does. All the dates that you use inside of functions and other rules like this have to be enclosed inside of pound symbols. Now, normally, Access will put those on there for you if it recognizes a date. And that's mostly because it has to be able to differentiate between a date and division. Because normally in math, that would be a division problem, right? 1 divided by 1 divided by 1980. When we get into programming Visual Basic in our advanced lessons, you'll see how that you have to remember to put those pound symbols on there. But in this case, Access will do it for you. Now, let's give it a try. Save your table. Let it perform the data check. All of my data matches up. Let's come in here and try changing one of these values. I'll put in 1/1/1975, and I get an error message. We'll put a custom validation text on it in a minute. I'll hit OK. That was good. It didn't allow a value before 1980. What about in the future? 6/1/12. And again, that worked fine too. I'll hit OK. Now today's date is 5/17. So I'm going to put in here 5/17/12, and that worked fine. How about tomorrow's date? 5/18. Oh, and keep in mind, like I mentioned, I believe in the first level, if you don't type a year in, it'll assume the current year. Okay, there's my warning message. It won't allow tomorrow's date, but it does allow today's date. So I'll hit OK and put it back to 5/17. Now, what happens if I type this in for a validation text? Must be between 1/1/80 and date. Let's see if this works. Let's try changing one of these to 1160. And it says must be between 1180 and date. Unfortunately, the validation text property doesn't use functions. What you put in there has to be the actual exact text that the user is going to see on the screen. So we'll have to say something in there like must be between 1180 and today's date. Something to verbally tell the user what the valid range of dates is. So I'll hit OK. I'll hit Escape a few times. I'll go back to Design View and just change this to today's date. So that, in a nutshell, is how the validation rule property works, and of course the validation text property. There's a lot more you can do with this. You can make some pretty complicated validation rules. You can actually make validation rules that span multiple fields. So you can check and make sure that this value and this value are within a particular range of data. We'll cover that when we get to the expert level classes.